The lilac dawn sky spread over the fairground, where a violinist pulled resin across the counter, and women adjusted their woolen capes to keep their fingers from getting wet in the morning dampness. The widows of market porters and craftswomen from the north, who sewed mittens and darned sacks, lined up at the old guard's table, where a stack of blank forms lay. Each of them knew that a signature meant a pass to a day of trade, while a refusal meant cold, debt, and an empty bowl at night. The ink on the quills was icy, and the captain's gaze was as dry as frozen bread. The narrator greets the audience, thanks them for taking the time to tune in to this episode, asks which cities and countries they are watching from, invites them to write about it in the comments, and wishes everyone a pleasant and focused listening experience without haste or fuss. The city in question stood on the trade route between the salt mines of the east and the fabrics of the Upper Rhine manufactories. Its council was subject to imperial authority, and in the last years of the 16th century, under the rule of a sovereign whose name was recorded in city protocols and collegiums, order was enforced here. Plague courtyards were marked with crosses. Bathhouse regulations were rewritten to separate hours for men and women, and supervision of behavior at the counter was introduced at fairs. The task of supervision was entrusted to the captain of the city guard, a man with seniority, battle scars, and a reputation as a strict collector of fines. Times were difficult. Winter brought months of hunger, flour prices skyrocketed, and, according to the accounting chamber, the treasury was short of revenue from bridge tolls. In such conditions, caring for morals quickly turned into a convenient sieve for money. A new document was added to the mandatory documents for merchants, a pledge of modesty. The ordinance adopted by the council at the end of late autumn did not directly mention such a form. It only referred to proper behavior and decency at the stalls, the prohibition of shouting and obscene gestures, and the fact that the sale of strong wine should be carried out with the permission of elders, but the captain had a paper instrument in his hands, thin sheets with a heading, a seal, and blank lines. The paper was rough, with barely noticeable wood fibers. The seal was not always printed evenly, and there were no dates in the upper margin. The women put a cross or their name under the line where they promised to behave modestly and not undermine public order. Otherwise, they would face a fine and loss of their place. No one argued. Arguing meant ruining the day, and a day at the fair fed the family for a week. It was not young girls or schoolgirls who lined up at this table, but adult craftswomen, widows, merchants' wives, and hired workers who knew the value of time and cold hands. They brought bundles of thread, bundles of brooms, rag dolls from which they had woven amulets in childhood, and bowls of dried fish. The captain required a signature and the designation of a guarantor, and most often the guarantor was the senior merchant of the row or the trustee of the guild. This is where the dullness familiar to any market began. A brief nod to the captain sometimes determined whether a hard-working woman would get a place under the awning or freeze in the wind at the end of the row where buyers did not linger. The dullness slowly turned into a mechanism. The blank lines on the form allowed the necessary words and amounts to be filled in later. And later meant after the merchant had left, after the noise of the fair day had subsided in the silence of the city. Formally, the city had documents designed to protect the weak. Clerics kept books of fines. Registers of printed forms were kept by the chancellor. And guilds had statutes with formulas for mutual assistance. But in times when every grain of flour was politics, paper turned out to be not a fence, but a blade. The captain referred to the rules. He explained that the forms protected public peace and that the guards were obliged to prevent moral corruption at the stalls. The interpretation seemed convenient because the air was thick with anxiety. In previous years, the city had experienced outbreaks of fever and ulcerative diseases. Bathhouses were closed out of fear, then reopened under the supervision of doctors. Monastic preachers recorded stories of debauchery in tunics in their chronicles, and although these were rhetorical formulas, they provided the captain with a moral backdrop. Thus, a myth arose that modesty could be protected not by institutions of support and security, but by a piece of thin gray paper with blank lines, where someone wrote down the necessary numbers and formulas as they saw fit. The morning of one of the big St. Michael's fairs became the point when the myth began to stir on the border with the document. First, 2 permanent stalls quietly disappeared from the market. The weaving sisters, adult women with 20 years of experience, suddenly did not get a place under the canopy. There were rumors that they did not fulfill their obligations properly. A few days later, rumors began to circulate about a fine that had allegedly been imposed retrospectively for indecent language. No one had heard any inappropriate words except the guards, but there was no record of the fine in the fine book. Instead, the captain had sheets of paper with a signature and the amount entered. The date was left blank. There was no mention of it in the register of issued forms. The stamp bore an old mark which, according to an administrative decree, had been replaced by a new matrix at the end of the previous year. There were discrepancies in various records, which any lawyer would recognize as grains of truth. The lawyer, whom we will refer to as the trustee, was not a hero of parables, but a city council official whose duties included reconciling receipts, checking forms, and approving charters. He noticed an alarming detail when reviewing the accounts of bridge tolls and warehouse fees. On market days, the revenue from fines for modesty obligations exceeded the usual amounts many times over, while the entries in the official book of fines remained the same. This meant that the money was not going where it was supposed to. The syndic requested a reconciliation of seals and forms. His attention was drawn to an absurd detail. On the captain's sheets, the ink of the merchant's signatures had the same shade, as if someone had written with the same pen in a closed room rather than in the wind, where ink thickens and spreads in a completely different way. What was even more disturbing was that the obligation sometimes fixed guilt not by action, but by possible danger of licentiousness, a formula unknown to any statute. Meanwhile, the market lived on with its heavy but persistent breath. Bread was sold in slices so that everyone could afford a piece. The doctor gave out bark and vinegar infusions for colds for a fee. At the bathhouse gate, the senior bath attendant wrote down the names of adult women for the morning hours, separate from the evening hours for men. As always, gossip could be heard in the crowd. Some claimed that the captain was saving the city from shame in this way, while others whispered that it was just a new way to get rich. Behind the arguments lay one harsh truth. Every merchant came to the fair not for abstract honor, but for coins to buy bread. And when she was asked to sign for admission, she agreed because reality left her no choice. The mechanism became embedded in everyday life like a splinter. At first you hardly feel it, then you accidentally touch it, and your finger won't work. The syndic was not in the habit of speaking in public. His work was done through papers and layers of dust on tables. He raised the decree changing the city seal to a new matrix. The date of the change was written in letters, and its authenticity was certified by the chancellor and 2 witnesses. Comparing this with the obligations from the captain's desk, the syndic saw that some of the documents had been stamped with the old seal on days when it had already been withdrawn. This was how sheets filled out later than the alleged signatures were processed. The obligation form had not been approved by the council at all. There was no record of such forms being issued in the archives, although all standard forms, from garbage removal permits to guard duty rosters, had their own serial numbers. This chaos did not appear to be accidental, but rather systematic. Against the backdrop of the paper war, human fear was flaring up. The adult traders knew that losing their place meant sending their children and elderly relatives out into the world, who were waiting to go to the bathhouse only after the day's earnings. When the guards approached them and reminded them that the form has been signed, the obligation has been violated, no one asked who had entered the amount later. The women chose the lesser of 2 evils: pay up and keep working. Some borrowed money from loan sharks, pawning rings or woolen cloth to pay for the alleged violation. The crack of such sacrifices was louder than the cries in the square. The syndic began to gather the threads. His assistant copied a series of discrepancies from the forms and compiled a table of recurring handwriting in the witness lines. The same curls appeared in documents where the witnesses were listed as different people. The city doctor, invited as an independent observer of handwriting and ink, noticed the identical thickness of the lines, as if the pen had been dipped in a quiet room rather than in the open air. The senior bath attendant confirmed that on the day when 2 adult merchants were accused of disorder at the bathhouse gate, the bathhouse was closed due to the collapse of the brick oven, which meant that references to disorder at the bathhouse gate could not be true. The details stuck together like wet flour into a tight lump. The myth of paper as a shield was crumbling at the seams. They said that the obligation would restrain tempers and quell the noise, as if the word itself, sealed with ink, could change the behavior of adults without the threat of hunger and the stick. But a document without a number and date is not a shield, but a stick in someone's hands. Sermons about modesty are convenient when they turn into greasy coins. And if once upon a time monastic mentors wrote about abstinence for health and peace in the home, now their language has become a label of legalized pressure, to which people have become accustomed, just as they become accustomed to the creaking of an old door in a barracks. It was not eloquence, but pedantry that could turn the situation around. The syndic compiled a list of all the forms used in the city service and found out that the standard sheets were kept by the chancellor, attached to the issue log, and laced together so that they could not be replaced. There was no lacing on the obligations of modesty, no numbering, no journals. This vacuum allowed amounts to be entered retroactively. In the same room where the trustee was sorting through the papers, he found an old decree on the right of guilds to file collective complaints. If 3 people of the same profession reported abuse, the council was obliged to consider the matter at its next meeting. There were 3 such people in the tailor's row: an older woman, her sister, and a neighbor, who was a basket weaver, each of whom was at least 40 years old, with long years of counting coins and knots behind them. They agreed to describe their daily routine and how the obligation turned into a net that tightened at the end of the day. Their words were not cries, but a list of facts: what time they arrive at the square, where they put the bundles, who approaches them, when they are asked to sign, where and when they first saw that the amounts were entered later. All this became the basis. Next, it was necessary to extract an admission from the office that the council had not approved such forms. The secretary, a man with a habit of hiding his eyes in ink, brought out a bound journal where the dates were honestly entered in the margins. Everything flowed as it should. But there was not a word about modesty. And then a principle as old as the city walls came into play. Anything that is not confirmed by a number, date, and stamp of the new matrix cannot be used to collect money for the treasury. This principle was not popular locally. It interfered with quick profits. But it was in the statutes, which had been rewritten before winter, when the plague was taking adult lives in the courtyards and forcing people to look at the words public order in a new way. At this time, the captain, unwilling to give in, began to threaten to revoke the fairgrounds. At a meeting of space allocators, where it was decided who would set up a stall under a canopy and who would be exposed to the wind, he reminded everyone that violators would not get a place. His position frightened the craftsmen more than fines. No adult merchant wanted to argue with the man who had the keys to the gate to the field. The pressure intensified under the guise of concern for a quiet market. But where pressure is applied silently, paper sometimes begins to speak. And if this story began with an icy drop of ink on a quill pen, it will continue with how that drop turns into evidence, through coincidences in handwriting, through changes in city seals, through calculations in the account book, where every penny has a line. This is how the first stage of the investigation unfolded. The myth of modesty under the seal collided with documents, and behind every cold fact stood someone's night kitchen, someone's pain from frostbitten fingers, someone's postponed bath. The trustee, who started with a dry check of the amounts, already understood that this was not about paper propriety, but about the right of adult women to trade without threat and extortion. He had not yet submitted a memo to the council, but he had prepared a draft. It contained proposals for standard numbered forms, a logbook for issuing sheets, and a ban on collection using forms without a date and a new stamp. He had to gather one last piece of evidence: the connection between the captain's people and the witnesses on the forms, to show how a small circle controlled access to the counters. And then the story that was usually whispered in the wind would become a line in a book, not someone's private stick. The syndic moved on, not through the loud halls, but through the narrow corridors that smelled of heated wax and stale paper. He began by asking the chancellor for a list of all the printed forms in use over the past 2 years, stacked them neatly, and began comparing the margins. Standard forms always had 3 reference points: a serial number, a place for the date, and a mark of issue with the clerk's signature. None of these references were found on the captain's obligations. In the copies found, the fields for the date were left blank, and in place of the number, there was grayish cellulose with barely noticeable fibers, as if someone had deliberately left space for future manipulation. Another small detail stood out in the comparison. The fold line on the obligations was different from that on the other sheets, as if they had been stored not in office folders, but in another personal folder, where the paper was folded to a different width. It was an insignificant detail, but it was details like this that kept the evidence from falling apart. The city was tense. The sourdough in the barrels smelled sour, and in the market square, the vendors, adult women, widows, and mature students who had become independent, measured the cold with thick shawls, and at the gates of the baths hung a sign with new rules: separation of hours, a requirement not to linger in the dressing room, installation of a boiler for boiling water. Doctors repeated that cleanliness was more important than shouting, but the authorities loved form and rhetoric. Under the captain, it was rhetoric that turned into attacks. The syndic made an extract from the cash books. On the days of the big fair, the fines collected by the guards tripled, although the official registers recorded the usual amounts. He noted the discrepancy in pencil, but then erased it, rewriting his observation in pen in its final form. Any draft, if picked up by a detractor, becomes a weak spot. For such investigations, the final line must be firm. The syndic then turned to the written records of the guilds. The senior members of the Tanners and Tailors Guilds provided statutes stating that new forms of behavioral control must be agreed upon by the council and kept in the chancellery under lock and key. The statutes referred to an old ordinance adopted at a time when the city was just recovering from a harsh winter and a plague epidemic. and all the lists said the same thing. Without a number, no one could be prosecuted for anything. This rule pointed the way forward, but one formula was not enough. It was necessary to show how empty lines were turned into a predatory mechanism. The syndic decided to follow the chain of arrows that left ink stains and began to compare the names of the witnesses. The same initials were repeated with ridiculous regularity, and among them were the names of the senior guard and 2 clerks from the palace guard. It turned out that those who were supposed to be watching were the ones who testified, and this meant a conflict of interest, which is usually written about cautiously, but which has a powerful influence. Life at the market was pressured by time. Adult female traders got up before dawn to take their place under the awning, and by the end of the day, their strength was gone. When the captain's men approached them and reminded them about the signature, there was no time to argue, and it was unsafe to do so. The connection between paper and shame was particularly evident here. It was not fear for moral order, but for access to bread money that made women vulnerable. They were not puppets of rumors. These women had survived years without husbands, pulling the cart and running the household themselves, knowing how to stretch dried fish for 2 meals. They did not need anyone's guiding hand. They needed access to the counter and a guarantee that their day would not be ruined by someone else's whim. The discrepancies sounded all the clearer when the trustee looked up from the registers. An old matrix, previously confiscated by decree, was found in the city seal storage warehouse. There was a tiny crack on the edge of the matrix that distinguished it from the new one. The impressions on the captain's obligations bore this barely noticeable defect. This meant that someone had used the confiscated matrix, or that some of the sheets had been stamped later, covering up the missing dates. The syndic wrote an explanatory note listing the signs: the absence of a number series, the stamp from the removed matrix, the same shade of ink in the lines of different days, the repeated handwriting of the witnesses. He placed the note on the table of the city revenue advisor. The next step was to wait, but time was running out. While the office meetings were going on, the captain increased the pressure, reminding everyone that loyal people would get a place at the next fair, while inconvenient ones could trade outside the moat. The people's economy responded with a sharp, almost inaudible crunch. Several merchants sold their woolen blankets in winter to cover another retroactive fine. 2 adult craftswomen closed their shop for a week because they didn't have enough money for flour and firewood. The market stalls lay sprawled like bare wood. The fibers through which water runs became visible. Syndic understood that statistics were needed not as decoration, but as a language that the council would understand. He collected information on the number of adult female traders who had lost their places and compared these cases with the days when the obligations were signed en masse. It turned out that the peaks coincided with the daily guard shifts of the captain's shift. On other days, when deputies were on duty, the conflicts disappeared. It was like a boot print on wet ground. The doctor's records came into play, which documented bruises and cold-related complications among the traders who stood in the wind after losing their awnings. The doctor, not being a politician, recorded accurately. One had joint inflammation, another had fainted from exhaustion, and a third had a lingering cough after a night in the rain. The council members did not understand the language of pain, but they understood the language of costs. Every illness of an adult worker's body took coins out of the family and brought with it requests for alms. The syndic carefully translated the medical lines into the language of city expenses: increased benefits, decreased trade turnover, increased burden on the treasury of baths and almshouses. He pointed out that unwise supervision does not strike at abstract modesty, but at income, and this always convinces those who hold the counting keys. At the turn of spring, the trustee gathered 3 elders from the guilds and suggested that they exercise their right to file a collective complaint. The trio brought letters that contained neither cries nor complaints about their fate. There were facts, descriptions of dates without numbers, indications of places, lists of witnesses whose hands were used to weighing raw materials, not tying cunning knots on paper. He attached these letters to his note. On the same day, he heard that the captain was angry and was reminding the distributors of places about obedience. The threat was clear. If the trustee achieved changes, the captain would cut off oxygen to the trading row and carry out an exemplary expulsion. But threats had their limits, and those limits were defined by documents. The council appointed a closed hearing. The syndic brought bundles of standard forms, rolled up in string, and placed them next to the obligations. The captain appeared with several guards and a stack of sheets of paper, which were still blank. The hearing proceeded without shouting. The names of the rules were repeated like a prayer: guild statutes, penalty books, ordinances on seals. At one point, the chancellor was asked to show the logbook for issuing forms. The obligations log was nowhere to be found. This created a pause in which the heart of the investigation could be heard gasping for air. The syndic carefully drew attention to the impressions of the old matrix. The chancellor confirmed that the old matrix was to be stored without use. The captain noted that the seal could have accidentally fallen on the table, but this argument fell apart in the threads of logic. For the hand to accidentally find the removed matrix, it would be necessary to open the warehouse, pull out the box, put it on the table, stamp several dozen sheets, and return the matrix to its place. The accident lost its meaning, like any story blown out of proportion. By this time, the syndic had made another comparison. He asked the scribes to rewrite random words with several witnesses whose names were repeated on the forms, and compared the lines of the curls. The coincidences were obvious. The witness from one sheet wrote with the same movement as the guard from the guard log, and another witness wrote letters like the clerk who kept the shift list. The narrow ring has its own handwriting. This became the very prepared twist that makes the scheme visible even to those who prefer not to see anything. But the story did not end there. The captain, realizing that formal arguments were slipping away, tried to rely on fear. He began to hint to the seat distributors that the council might close the fairgrounds altogether for the duration of the reorganization. This was a direct play against the city's revenue. The syndic, remaining dry, stated in a new note that threats to deprive the market of its place would hit the treasury harder than any noise from the stalls, and reminded everyone that the right to revise the rules did not mean stopping trade. He proposed an immediate partial solution, until the final forms were adopted, to invalidate any fines on forms without a date, number, or stamp from the old matrix, to temporarily entrust the issuance of places to the captain's deputies under the supervision of the guild elders. In this way, he cut off the captain's ability to pressure the ranks through fear, without resorting to loud words. The syndic understood that cutting the knot was not enough. It was also necessary to show people that paper could be a fence rather than a whip. He prepared a draft of a new standard form of Rules of Conduct at the Fair, where each field had meaning, number, date, reference to the ordinance, a line for the signature of not only the merchant, but also the clerk, as well as a column issued under number such and such, with a mark in the journal. At the bottom, he placed a square for a new seal, with a recognizable mark. It was not a victory in the lofty sense, but a working tool that minimized contact with the drabness. It was proposed that the forms be kept with the chancellor and issued according to a register with numbered sheets, so that the risk of substitution would be difficult, even for a cunning hand. He added a clause stating that any penalty would be recorded in the penalty book on the day the offense was committed. Retroactive penalties were prohibited under threat of punishment from the guards. While the bill was going through the council, the market was once again in turmoil. Women in gloves with cut-off fingertips counted coins and whispered their usual prayers without illusions. They knew that no ordinance could untangle the tightening knots in a single day. But in the short pauses between customers, a simple steadiness returned to their gaze. They saw marked sheets appear at the edge of the table where the seats were assigned, and how the clerk, who had previously been writing names on his knee, was now turning numbered pages. It was not yet a solution, but it was a step in the direction where paper ceased to be a trap. Meanwhile, the captain tried to change the plan. Rumors spread throughout the city that the council was ready to introduce new tariffs for behavior at the counters. The syndic prepared a response in advance in the form of an explanatory paper, where he calculated the maximum allowable administrative fine in relation to daily revenue, based on previous city rules. He proposed replacing vague wording about modesty with clear points: a ban on obscene gestures, a ban on crowding, and the obligation to collect trash from one's place. These points did not concern morals and bodies, but concerned order and cleanliness, areas that are measurable and do not turn into extortion. The project assumed that any fines would go to the treasury, not into the pockets of the shift workers, and that once every few days, the syndic would check the fine book against the register of issued forms. This mechanism did not require heroism. It required patience and signing the right line. The set of facts fell into place. The empty lines on the forms turned out to be pockets in which dates disappeared and amounts appeared. The old stamp revealed the time of manufacture of the sheets. The repetitive handwriting showed a closed circle of witnesses. The jumps in fees on market days indicated an influx of money bypassing the book. Threats to deprive them of their places confirmed the dependence of bread on the stick. There was no sensation in this picture, but there was a terrible simplicity. Adult women paid for access to their work with rhetoric covered by paper. And while the council habitually counted coins, the syndic stubbornly packed every cold fact into a form that could not be ignored. All that remained was to finalize the decision, to introduce standard forms with numbers and a logbook, to declare the old forms invalid, and to untie access to the counter from the whims of the guard. And then came the confrontation with those who were accustomed to considering power their private craft. He decided not to break the excessive silence, but to reconfigure it, and therefore began to shift the emphasis from modesty to order, raising the statutes of cleanliness and accountability as a counterweight to vague requirements. While the note was lying in the council, a wave of hidden fatigue swept through the market. Adult traders made their usual rounds between the awnings, exchanged small change for whole coins, saved their steps so that their backs wouldn't ache by evening, and cut off conversations when the captain or someone from his shift passed by. The murky water in the street baths darkened faster than usual because the day was tense. The bath attendant swore quietly by his standards, noting that women catch colds more often when they stand at the end of the row without a canopy. The doctor was forced to record again the lingering coughs, headaches from the constant cold, and inflammation in the joints of the hands of those who had been moving needles or twisting rope all day. These minor wounds of the day were no less real than the stamps on the papers, and so they were entered into the columns as invisible but constant expenditures of human strength. The syndic pulled out one thread after another. He discovered that some of the witnesses on the forms were a small circle of people whom the captain trusted to allocate places between the tents. The names were repeated: the senior member of the shift, the clerk with quick handwriting, the guard with a confident touch on the letter, which always left a tiny trace of a notch. This repetition meant not only a conflict of interest, but also a vulnerability that could be used to show the council that the control mechanism had become a source of personal gain. Here, a subtle but important detail emerged. On certain days, obligations were signed on a particularly large scale, and this coincided with visits by merchants from distant places. When the field was more crowded than usual, prices rose more rapidly, and any empty counter was immediately occupied by strangers. Thus, the fear of losing one's place on these particular days turned empty lines into inflated fees and gave the captain's crew the opportunity to collect money no less effectively than a bridge toll. The myth that paper protects one's livelihood worked for vanity, not for peace. The council, attentive to income, scheduled another meeting, this time with the participation of the guild elders. The statutes and books of fines, which smelled of stale ink vinegar, were placed on the table. The comparison was made not by eye, but line by line. The book of fines contained penalties for jostling, for uncollected garbage, for quarrelsome shouting, for selling unmarked surrogate wine. These were old and understandable cases. But there were no mass records of modesty, and the amounts that passed through the hands of the guards for obligations did not make it into the city book. The syndic confirmed the facts with a formula that sounds good to people who believe that anything not in the book is not for the treasury. He added to this a series of signs of forgery, an old seal matrix, blank dates, the absence of a form issuance log, the repetition of the witness signature, and the same shade of ink on sheets allegedly signed on different days and in different weather conditions. He immediately proposed not a sweeping accusation, but a mechanical solution to immediately prohibit collections on forms without a number and date, to declare old blank forms invalid, to introduce a numbered issuance log, and to store the supply of forms with the chancellor, not with the guards. The captain's threat to respond by closing the market square was almost inevitable, and it happened. He gathered the seat distributors and announced through whispering people that the field could be closed until order is restored, and that dissidents risked trading outside the moat. This was not a direct order, but rather pressure by habit. The guards hinted, and the market shrunk. The syndicate had prepared a countermeasure in advance. It brought up for discussion a ready-made set of standard forms of rules of conduct at the counter, with numbering, references to city ordinances, and a blank field for the date, which by definition could not be left blank. He proposed linking the issuance of forms to specific days and specific rows, and recording the issuance in a journal with numbered pages and stitching. Storage, with the chancellor. Issuance, through the guild elders, not through the guard shift. At the bottom of the form was a block for a new stamp, the impression of which could not be confused with the old one. Each penalty had to be entered in the penalty book on the same day to eliminate the possibility of backdating amounts. It didn't sound like a battle, but it was mechanisms such as simple lacing, numbering, and a logbook that cut off the air supply to unauthorized schemes. Meanwhile, the seasonal cold was setting in on the field, and the small cruelties of the day were becoming a habit. Adult women retied their headscarves, smeared their hands with grease to prevent their skin from cracking in the wind, and listened as their neighbor whispered that she had borrowed money for another fine and was now paying it back slowly, losing money on each exchange. It was everyday life, where there were no cries and no spectacles, but there was fatigue that squeezed the chest by evening, and there was no strength to light the stove at full power. In such environments, the rhetoric of modesty always prevails over facts, until the moment comes to check the seals and books. At the same time, the religious background intensified. Monastic preachers, who had survived many years of epidemic seasons, reminded people in leaflets about chastity and silence. And this language, although intended to promote peace in the community, easily became a screen through which the captain announced in a natural tone that the new form was a concern for moral peace. The syndic pointedly separated these leaflets from the document, insisting that moral instruction was not the same as monetary penalties and should not be reduced to a stamp under an empty line. The first prepared twist came when the chancellor, digging up old correspondence about seals, found a duplicate record of the seizure of the captain's seal matrix and the change of the mark. This correspondence included a note stating that the old matrix was kept in a sealed box, which was only opened when the archives were rechecked in the presence of 2 witnesses and with a note in the log. The box was indeed sealed, but the wax seal had been pressed again, as if it had been pressed once more for appearance's sake, without changing the thread. This meant that the box had been opened without the proper entry being made. Whoever made the impressions on the obligations had a key and access to the warehouse. There were few people with such access, and the captain was one of them by virtue of his position. Direct guilt in a paper system is rarely established as in moralistic plays, but the combination of indirect evidence becomes the only line of inquiry if each detail coincides with the next. The second prepared twist manifested itself unexpectedly in the physics of the paper. The fold lines on the blank forms that the captain kept in his folders did not match those on the office forms. This had already been noted, but now the chancellor brought a hole punch from his cabinet, a tool used to pierce the lacing. On normal forms, the 2 holes were strictly at the same distance from the edge, but on the captain's commitments, there were none at all. This meant that the forms were printed separately, outside the office machine, and without subsequent stitching. You cannot stitch air, you cannot stitch an empty space. This meant that penalties imposed on such forms could not be considered legal. The advisors, accustomed to handling paper with care, began to talk not about morality or subtle control, but about the register and the number. The language shifted toward the provable. The third prepared turn came when the trustee received a statement of small coin change from the Treasury. The statement showed that on market days, the exchange for large coins was particularly high among 2 specific guards. They often brought bags of small change, which they exchanged for heavier coins. In their explanatory notes, these people referred to accumulated daily wages, but the guards did not have the right to collect cash payments without a mark in the book. The coincidence of time, persons, and the increase in fines formed a chain. Blank forms, impressions of the old seal, the absence of a journal, the repeated handwriting of witnesses, the exchange of small change for large coins by the same people. It was impossible to pull one link out of this chain without unraveling the rest. The myth of modesty under the seal began to take shape as a documented scheme of extortion. The blow to the scheme was not heroic, but procedural. The council made an interim decision, temporarily, until the final approval of the new rules, to consider invalid all fines based on forms without a number and date, and with an old stamp, to entrust the issuance of places to the captain's deputies in the presence of the senior guilds, to extend to the market field the rule of mandatory recording of any penalty in the penalty book on the day of the event, to reconcile all forms with the issuance log, which did not yet exist, meaning that the reconciliation would show 0. Adult merchants felt the change not at the level of loud announcements, but at the level of small details. The clerk at the distribution table began to write out neat numbered sheets where each line had meaning, and stopped accepting sheets with blank dates from the guards. Several old fines were left hanging in the air. They were no longer being collected, and those who had already paid were entered by the trustee into a list for future payments to the treasury, so as not to stir up quarrels, but to acknowledge the fact that the paper had lost its validity. The captain tried to respond with pressure as before. Rumor had it that he would ask the coordinators from the guilds to clear the ranks of loiterers on inspection days so that he could cite disorder and demand a male guard for the entire field. In response, the syndic prepared an order for the senior bath attendants and the doctor to record the actual state of the ranks, how much crowding there was, whether there were any violations of order, how many times a day the trash was taken out, and how often the guards had to intervene. The reports from the bath attendants and the doctor were dry. Order was within normal limits. Garbage was taken out regularly, without any incidents. This cut off the captain's rhetoric of disorder. The field became a document, not a rumor. The decisive move came when the chancellor put the draft standard forms and issue log to a vote. The form included a number, date, reference to the ordinance, signatures of both parties, a column for marking delivery under the number in the bound log, and a field for a new stamp, the matrix of which was kept under guard in the city chamber. The journal was a book with numbered pages, bound with thick thread, in which all issued forms were entered in order, indicating the day and number. Any loss of a page immediately became apparent due to the break in the numbering. Old obligations, without a number and date, were automatically considered invalid. The guards no longer had the right to keep stacks of forms with them. Everything was stored in the chamber, issued through the chancellor, and returned in the form of an entry in the Book of Fines. It was not a beautiful moral, but everyday paper engineering. By the time the new forms left the chamber, a dull thaw had set in the city. The water in the gutters flowed faster, but the mud hid the same poverty. Adult market women dragged bundles, navigating the currents like experienced rowers in a turbulent stream. They lived not by uplifting slogans, but by the numbering of lines, which became their protection. When another guard tried to remind them of the old obligation, the clerk looked up and said that a form without a number and date was now a blank piece of paper. These words were spoken without shouting or agitation, but their effect was coldly respectful. The shadow of the stick retreated a step. The guild elders noted that the cash collections for the fair days went as expected, and the treasury recorded receipts without any mysterious dips or spikes. The captain did not leave immediately. He clung to power as if it were a habit, but now the main thing had been taken from him: the ability to change the order with a few empty lines. He had to explain himself to the council about the old seal and the empty dates, and although no direct blame was written in the text, he was accused of negligence in handling forms, and his powers to allocate places were reduced. For human life, this meant that from now on, the path to the counter no longer depended on his brief nod. And for history, it meant that the myth of modesty under the seal gave way to documentation, numbering, dates, stitching, mandatory recording, and a ban on retroactive charges. The doctor stopped noting a surge in colds in the days after the fairs because women no longer stood without a tent due to a sudden fine. The bath attendant recorded a decrease in the load on the charity bath on cold days because the merchants could pay for admission without debt. The treasurer saw neat columns of coins without secret exchanges at the same guard post. All this did not resemble a feat, but a feat was unnecessary here. History moved forward thanks to a boring procedure that proved stronger than the cruelty of habit. This was the revealing sting of the story. Where paper is declared a shield of morals, it too often serves as a wallet for those who hold the seal. And only when the sheets are numbered and the lines are dated does the shield cease to be a scarecrow and become a wall that a hand with an extortionate pen cannot climb over. However, there were still some loose ends. Several women who had already paid for invalid sheets asked for their payments to be credited toward future fees, and the trustee insisted that the treasury find a form of compensation that would not turn it into a new chain of humiliation. In the narrow circle, accustomed to old connections, there were grumbles that the procedure restricted maneuverability, and in this grumbling, one could hear the old desire to control empty lines. Therefore, the next task was to consolidate the new system so that it would survive the change of personnel. The trustee proposed an annual reconciliation of the journals with the participation of the guilds, the doctor, and the bath attendant as independent witnesses of everyday life. And while the field swallowed the meltwater, he prepared another dry note, in which there were no loud words or foreign names, only lines that kept the story real. The date, number, seal of the new matrix, the scribe's signature, the signature of the recipient of the form, and confirmation that the old forms were blank paper. History moved on, pulling small but persistent forms of pressure out of the darkness and turning them into what they should be in a city where people trade, get sick, and survive. Records that no longer beat the body, but serve as a fence around it. Above, the calendar was approaching the warm season, when the dampness leaves the stone. But the anxiety did not dissipate, only changed shape. The captain, having lost some of his leverage, tried to take the dispute out of the realm of accounting and into the realm of myths. Through his acquaintances, he circulated leaflets throughout the city, with instructions about silence at the counters and modesty in the ranks. In normal years, such leaflets went unnoticed. Monastic voices always sounded near the market, calling for moderation and order. But now, the leaflets contained phrases that bridged the gap between moralizing and money. The idea was conveyed that obligations protect society better than any charter, and therefore challenging the forms was tantamount to attacking peace in the community. For many weary people, this sounded convincing. The adult merchants did not want a new round of conflict. They had enough worries with debts and cold hands. And with this, the captain hoped to cover the old empty lines with a new moral cloak. The syndicate responded not with counter-arguments, but with facts about what actually protects peace. He collected reports from bath attendants. On cold days, the load on the charity bathhouse fell when the traders worked without incident under the canopy all day long, rather than standing idle in the wind because of sudden fines. The doctor prepared a simple table. There were fewer evening fainting spells from exhaustion, and fewer inflammations of the joints of the hands and elbows when access to the place did not depend on arbitrary requirements. The treasurer added a dry column. The proceeds from the fair collection are more even when there are no small change insertions, which are then exchanged in the wallets of the same guards. This combination of everyday life, the body, and accounting became a quiet body of evidence that was more difficult to criticize than the rhetoric of leaflets. It showed that order grows out of clear regulations and the protection of labor, not out of an empty field for sums. Then the captain shifted his attack to another plane. He tried to regain power over the seat distributors through other people's hands. He gathered people who were used to standing on the border and revived the old practice of temporary hiding. He suggested that the distributors keep some of the numbered forms for themselves so that later, according to personal promises, they could help those in need. It looked like charity, but it turned new forms into the old tax. The syndicate had anticipated this option. The issuance log was kept not only by the chancellor, but also by 2 guild elders who checked the lacing and numbers weekly. When a gap in the numbering was discovered, it turned out that the sheets had disappeared at the customs house at the eastern gate. A comparison of dates and tiny wax marks on the lacing revealed the moment of interference. This was another prepared twist. The system showed that even without loud words, it was capable of highlighting a loophole, thus neutralizing the attempt to bend the new rules to old habits. At the same time, the trustee took up the issue where reforms often fail: the return of money already paid on invalid sheets. He understood that demanding immediate sums from the treasury would give rise to new resentment among those who distribute the city's meager funds. Therefore, he proposed not to distribute the money in the square, but to use a mechanical method of offsetting. Each adult merchant who presented a commitment sheet without a number and date was recorded in a separate book of refunds. During subsequent collections, Exactly the amount that had been paid on the blank form was deducted from her. For those who paid the moneylender, the guilds specified the term for which they would provide an interest-free loan from their mutual aid pool, and the chancellor made a note that the debt would be closed by offsetting. This scheme required patience and discipline, but it prevented the compensation from turning into a new humiliation. Bath attendants and doctors, as independent witnesses to everyday life, were included in the annual reconciliation of returns, presenting records of the condition of those who had incurred health expenses. The captain tried to strike fear into the hearts of the market traders. He spread rumors that auditors from the upper house might come and demand a complete halt to trading under the pretext of restoring order. The word auditor sounded as bad as the winter wind in the city. It was feared no less than the plague. The syndic took a step toward this fear, but turned it against the scheme. He himself prepared a request for a desk audit from the district chamber. The summons was accompanied not by a complaint, but by methodological tables. Which forms are in use, how the journals are bound, how penalties are recorded without delay, which sections are most at risk of empty lines. He attached to the invitation a map of the fairground, on which the rows were numbered and the places had conditional coordinates. The Chamber of Accounts did not send a reprimand, but proposed to conduct a demonstration reconciliation together with the city clerks. An outside view revealed what is usually kept quiet inside: the repetitiveness of the curls of handwriting in the lines of the witnesses, and the discrepancy between the number of places issued and the number of sheets recorded in the distributor's journal. While the chamber verification was underway, the city held its breath. Adult traders were accustomed to both sides, the side of the usual levies and the side of the new numbering. They lived not on hopes, but on cautious economy and small reliefs. When they did not have to hide their bundles at night with relatives because of the threat of relocation, when, during a gloomy rain, they could stand all day under a canopy without paying for spoiling the order with someone's mood. At the same time, the religious background intensified. The word chastity was heard again in sermons, but the syndic ensured that the leaflets with instructions distributed by the monastery printing house had a note on the back stating that they were not related to monetary penalties and were not subject to presentation at the guard's desk. This small line became another, less noticeable but important inoculation. The myth ceased to be attached to the document on paper. The chamber inspection yielded the main technical result. The district chamber approved the standard form, added another security feature to it, a microscopic mark in the new seal's imprint, which could only be seen when the sheet was tilted under the light, and required the old matrix to be stored in a different place, under a double seal with the chamber's stamp. It also specified that the issuance log must have a numbered tape sewn through the entire block on the spine. These details, seemingly insignificant at first glance, turned out to be the very steel lace that keeps the market from falling apart. At the insistence of the syndicate, the council introduced a rule into the guild statutes. Without an entry in the book of fines, there are no penalties. Without a number on the rules of conduct form, no conversation in the market begins. Without a ribbon on the spine, the journal is not considered valid. During those same days, the treasurer established the habit of posting the total amount of fees collected on market days on the bulletin board so that any adult could see how coins turned into lines. Transparency does not cure poverty, but it deprives the usual money devourers of air. Seeing that his options were narrowing, the captain went on the defensive. He sent an explanatory note to the council, blaming the inexperience of the clerks and coincidences of issuance. The council, avoiding strong words, removed him from the distribution of places and transferred this function to his deputies under the supervision of the guild elders and the chancellor. For the captain, this was tantamount to losing the main lever of his daily power. He still had the guards, the night patrols, the entrance gates, but the thin thread that entangled lives, access to the counter, was slipping away. He could still exert pressure through rituals and hints, but the document cut off the scope for hints. It was no longer possible to revoke a place by referring to an empty line. After the invasion of bureaucratic logic into everyday life, the city began to look at paper differently. Adult traders, who used to be afraid of any piece of paper, now distinguished between the form with a number and stitching, from the old, smooth, palm-like blank. They stopped carrying obligations with them like talismans, and on the contrary, learned to ask the scribe for the number and entry in the journal. This little bit of knowledge was like a warm shawl in the wind. It didn't save them from everything, but it kept the warmth where fear had previously taken it away. The doctor noted a decline in endless colds after market days. The bathhouse attendant noted the evenness of the queues and the stabilization of fees, and the treasurer noted the disappearance of strange exchanges of small change among the same people. These three different voices added up to what is commonly referred to as the health of the city, although in reality, it was simply the absence of someone's sticky fingers in someone else's pocket. It cannot be said that the resistance had dissolved. There were still people around the captain who disliked the syndicate for putting paper above the usual understanding. They whispered in taverns, assuring each other that women are to blame, or that modesty cannot be measured by a number. But where firmware and numbers come into play, whispers cease to have economic power. The syndic understood that this victory was not a one-time thing, but needed to be repeated every year, just as a shoelace must be retied if it has loosened. He insisted on an annual joint verification day. The chancellor brings the issuance journal, the guilds bring their books, the bathhouse attendant brings the workload records, the doctor brings the disease records, and the treasurer brings the collection columns. The reconciliation day became a somber celebration of the city's maturity. People were shown how the fields in uniform protect not some abstract honor, but the ability of families to survive a cold week without unnecessary debts. At the same time, the syndic took care of the channel through which the captain once made impressions with an old matrix. The sealed box was taken to the chamber, sealed with double wax, and entered into a separate register with the seal of the district chamber authority. The key was kept not by the guard, but by the chancellor and the representative of the chamber, and it could only be opened by 3 people: the chancellor, the chamber, and the guild elder. To the average person, this seemed like an excessive ceremony, but it was precisely such unnecessary steps that turned the stamp into an instrument of the city, rather than a pretext for extortion. In case someone tried to print forms outside the office, the chamber required printers to put an invisible mark in the paper. It wouldn't be needed every day, but it would save a whole year. Adult female traders endured these months like a marathon without a finish line. They did not expect the city to become friendly. They wanted smooth sailing without unpredictable setbacks. For them, the outcome was not expressed in the word justice, but in their meager earnings, in the opportunity to go to the bathhouse at the appointed hours, in the fact that a cold cough did not repel buyers from the counter because they did not have to stand in the rain for a lesson in modesty. Some of them returned part of what they had paid through the credit system. Others simply did not pay the new bills because it became impossible to pay them formally. Still others saw how their neighbor, who had been paying off her debt to the moneylender all winter for an old obligation, finally stopped giving away her last pennies and began to save up for flour. Such changes do not require trumpets and hymns. It is enough that the number cannot disappear from the journal and the date cannot be backdated. And yet the syndic was not deluded. He knew that any tool could become a stick again over time if left unattended. He insisted on adding a note to the city ordinance about the connection between moral instruction and monetary penalties. The former is a matter for leaflets and sermons, the latter for books and issues. They should not coincide. He pushed another invisible latch. The guild statutes included the obligation to teach apprentices and young masters to read standard forms and recognize the signs of a valid document. It was, in essence, paper security literacy, as necessary as the ability to lock a chest. The training did not last long, but it was enough to ensure that when a person saw a blank line, their reaction would not be one of resignation, but rather a question about the number and journal. Where once blank lines turned into extortion, now there were numbers, laces, and stubs with tape. Where old matrix stamps pressed paper in a closed room, now the exposure of a micromark revealed the substitution. Where witnesses used to come from the same narrow circle, signatures now had to be varied. One witness from the guild, the second from the office. All these seemingly boring details formed a fence within which the inhabitants returned to their difficult but recognizable everyday life. The city did not become kinder. It became slightly less convenient for those who build power on empty lines. The myth that modesty is protected by a piece of paper gave way to the document. Numbering, date, stitching, journal, chamber mark, and annual reconciliation, where the bath attendant and the doctor speak the language of health, and the treasurer speaks the language of coins. And another small but accurate detail was added to the fabric of this story. On the bulletin board, next to the bath schedule, a sheet with explanations about the forms was hung, written in simple words for those who had no time to understand the intricacies of the office. It said that the actual form has a number and date, that there are no penalties without an entry in the book, that moral sheets are not presented at the guard's desk, and that any amounts for rules of conduct go only through the treasury with the clerk's mark. People read it as a guide to survival. This was a quiet victory. Instead of a stick covered with preaching, the city received a ruler with which to measure shelves and measure the distance between lace holes. And behind this ruler, the faces of adult women reappeared, who from the very beginning were not the object of modesty protection, but people of labor, health, and the right to their place under the canopy. By the end of the year, it became apparent how heavy habits were giving way to the subtle but strong threads of a new order. And yet the shadow of the old scheme still lingered among the ranks. People dependent on short-term agreements tried to return to their former recklessness through small detours. Some pushed the distributors of places to help the guards, while others whispered to merchants from distant places that the number on the form was just for show, and that it was enough to greet the right person firmly for the date to appear when it was convenient. These whispers were met not with loud statements, but with even more dry details. A separate book was kept in the office, where the unique features of each batch of forms were recorded: the density of the paper, the position of the microscopic mark in the imprint, even the imperfection of the knife used to cut the stack. Comparing these features with any sheet displayed at the fair became as quick as a habitual work gesture. Where "that's how it's done" used to live, now there was a table. Syndic, realizing that paper was not a panacea but a craft, continued to link accounting with everyday life. He insisted that the guild statutes include the obligation to keep simple memos for adult merchants: how to check the form, where to look on the spine of the journal, what to ask the scribe, how a moral leaflet differs from a collection document. The memos were written without bureaucratic jargon, briefly, so that they could be read on the run between customers. They were placed in a box at the distributors, nailed to the entrance of the bathhouse, rolled into a tube on the edge of the counters where the small change lay. It was the very literacy of paper security that trains the hand to numbers and dates, just as a needle trains the finger to neat stitches. Soon, the last loop holding the old scheme together became apparent. Several people from the captain's entourage tried to take advantage of the new refund system. They persuaded women to bring old empty forms to them personally in exchange for a promise to speed up the credit. This kind of mediation rarely leaves a trace on paper, but it leaves a trace in the pace. The chancellor noticed that some names came up too often in conversations about returns, and in the credit book, these names were at the very end of the line, as if they were being kept in limbo on purpose. The syndic brought together three realities on one sheet of paper: the names of the intermediaries, the delays in returns, and the fact that these people belonged to the former circle of witnesses. The result was a familiar pattern, only turned towards a new circle. The response was again mechanical. The return had a simple route without faces. The woman submitted the old invalid sheet to the Guild's Mutual Aid Fund. A note from there went to the Chancellor. The Chancellor checked the form against the party journal and made a note of the credit for the next collection. Any attempt to help out of turn lost its meaning because the queue became visible to the senior guilds, and the list of credited amounts was posted once a week next to the bathhouse clock. There was no romance in this, but it was a salvation from sticky promises that always fade away without a trace. Meanwhile, the city was resting from major disasters, but not from minor illnesses. Adult merchants returned from the bathhouse not in feverish silence, but in their usual fatigue. The doctor noted that the lingering coughs after the fair days were on the decline. The treasurer rejoiced at the steady columns of fees, which no longer fluctuated with each change of guard. Another innovation appeared on the board at the market gate. Short, weekly reports, explaining in simple terms how many forms had been issued, how many fines had been recorded in the book, and how many credits had been awarded. No names were mentioned there, only numbers, written out in words as required by city regulations, and this made the reports safe but tangible, like a rock to lean on in a moment of wind. For people accustomed to living from fair to fair, such a rock is more important than a living voice. It contains less deception and more stability. The district chamber calmed down, but did not leave. They sent letters requesting annual confirmation of the seal's integrity and the integrity of the magazine stubs. For the guards, this became a tedious humiliation, and for the city, a new ritual that, unlike the previous ones, did not oppress, but protected. The key to the box with the old matrix remained with the Chancellor and the Chamber's envoy. Opening the box now turned into a small ceremony with a triple mark and almost monastic silence. One could smile at this heavy caution, but it was precisely this that prevented the old shadow from returning to where money flows in a light stream while no one is looking at the number. Meanwhile, the captain was dealing with his limitations in different ways. At first, he held his ground, pretending that the new system was his idea. Then he tried to get his influence back through cleanliness rules, asking to expand the list of behavior violations to include vague wording. Here he was stopped by the bath attendants. They wrote to the council that vagueness in the market always smacks of fines rather than cleanliness, and therefore the rules must be measurable. Trash in its place, no crowding, a ban on the sale of unmarked surrogate wine. The doctor added that an attempt to replace order with moralizing would again result in colds and ulcers, because people would be pushed out from under the awnings into the wind and rain for the sake of edification. The syndic collected this dry evidence into a single note and forwarded it to the council. The council preferred measurable purity to vague modesty. The list of violations remained narrow and understandable, and everything related to morals was returned to the preachers, removing the financial consequences. Where there is no financial incentive, rhetoric loses its grip. There were also personal stories in which the large-scale scheme touched people's hearts. Several adult women, who had paid according to the old lists, continued to repay their debts to the moneylenders because they were embarrassed to go to the guild's mutual aid fund. Then the elders organized a quiet collection, not in the square, not to the beat of drums, but among themselves. Those who could paid an extra coin into a common bowl to cover a couple of the heaviest interest rates. At the same time, the office noted these cases separately in the repayment book so that the credits would not be lost in the goodwill and would have a documented end. And here a feature of the new era manifested itself. Kindness did not replace accounting, and accounting did not cancel kindness. Together, they extinguished the consequences that a once empty form had placed on the shoulders of weary people. A visible sign of the change was the distribution of places at the next big fair, when merchants from distant lands came to the city. Previously, such days were a convenient time for increased fees under the guise of obligations, because it was easy to catch every newcomer in the fear of remaining at the end of the line. Now the order was based on numbered sheets, and the clerk, without looking at faces, turned the pages of the journal, while the senior guild members simply noted the goods delivered. Those who were used to negotiating behind the scenes tried to wink and whisper, but their whispers were drowned out by the lacing. Newcomers quickly learned from their neighbors. If there is no number and date on the form, it is not a form. If the penalty is not recorded in the book on the same day, it does not exist. If the guards at the table demand to see a moralizing leaflet from the monastery's printing house, this is wrong. Moralizing leaflets are not presented anywhere except on the walls and to one's own conscience. These simple rules, spoken quietly and without pretense, changed not only the bureaucratic desk, but also the rhythm of conversation between people. The last knot remained: the fate of the captain. The city avoided direct accusations because the team needed people who knew the ins and outs, and to appear in the square with a stigma meant to give rise to a new wave of resentment, ready to take revenge through petty crumbs. The council found a middle ground. The captain was sent to supervise the night guards and the entrance gates, removing from him the distribution of places and any involvement in monetary penalties. At the same time, those whose signatures were most often found in the witnesses line were removed from his shift and sent to jobs where testimony is replaced by a note of the time and route. It looked mild, but in essence, it broke the circle. People who lived off empty lines lost their emptiness on both sides. Formally, no one accused anyone, but in reality their skills were no longer being paid for. The syndic did not celebrate. He wrote down in his desk what steps to repeat annually. verification of seals, verification of journals, a public list of fair collection results in words, updating of memos, a meeting with bath attendants, and a doctor about the impact of rules on health, checking guild statutes for bloated wording, a chamber day, with the district chamber if necessary. He understood that the system was held together not by goodwill, but by the repetition of procedures. Just as a sluice gate does not hold back water with words, but only with a heavy flap that is closed every spring. This is the boring knowledge on which cities are built. Gradually, the myth lost its voice, replacing real labor protection with rhetoric about protecting modesty became inconvenient and unprofitable. Moral leaflets returned to where they came from, to walls, sermons, and private instruction, where they did not turn into currency. The document, on the contrary, grew stronger. Number, date, stitching, journal, imprint of a new matrix, microscopic mark, list of violations, which is tied to cleanliness and order, and not to someone else's temperament. Our history stretches between these two shores, in which adult women, who never became heroines of market legends, were given the opportunity to trade not by the grace of the guards, but by the right of a citizen to a place under the awning. The result was born out of human decisions. The guilds decided to call a spade and legalized mutual assistance. The chancellor decided to show books without selective omissions. Bath attendants and doctors decided to speak directly about the connection between order and health. The treasurer decided not to turn a blind eye to small exchanges between the same people. The council decided to prefer measurability to vague faith in the stick. The district chamber decided to impose its heavy but honest regulations on city life. Each of these decisions is not heroism, but dry responsibility that has become a habit. And when, on another gray morning, the wind rose in the field, with light frost clinging to the eyelashes, there was no longer the usual thick whispering at the distributor's table. The clerk turned the stitched book with a long-established movement, leaned over the line where the number stood, and wrote the date in words, as required. The guild elder listened, but did not interfere in the emptiness. There was no emptiness left. The woman who came to take her place in line had hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the cold, the usual enemy of any market. And if at this point our story resembles a confession, it is devoid of metaphysical morality. It is merely an acknowledgement that paper can be both a whip and a door vestibule, and that turning a whip into a vestibule is not thunder, but craftsmanship. The counters stood, the bathhouse was heated, the doctor made his notes, the treasurer wrote columns of words on the board, and the myth of the guardians of honor who protect the world with empty lines was put back into a box with an old matrix, sealed with double wax, where it belonged, as a reminder that without a number, date, and book, any beauty becomes an instrument of oppression. In this silence, the final human outcome was reached. The women reached the canopy without humiliation. The city was brought to order without harsh rhetoric, and power returned to where it is seen in the charter, rather than guessed at in someone's eyes.